Good morning. Welcome to Reserve Worship. I'm so glad you're here this morning. My name is AndreaSummers. I'm a professor at Southern Wesleyan University. I teach in the religion department there, and I've actually worshiped with you before at Reserve Worship, but this is the first time I have the privilege of getting to preach. So go ahead and join with me as we worship together with Sean Anderson.
What wondrous love is this, O my soul, O my soul? What wondrous love is this, O my soul? What wondrous love is this to cause the Lord of bliss to bear the dreadful curse for my soul, for my soul, to bear the dreadful curse for my soul. What wondrous love is this, O my soul, my soul? What wondrous love is this, O my soul? What wondrous love is this that caused the Lord of life to lay aside his crown for my soul, to lay aside his crown for my soul. To God and to the Lamb I will sing, I will sing. To God and to the Lamb I will sing. To God and to the Lamb who is the great I am. While millions join the song, I will sing, I will sing. While millions join the song, I will sing. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on, I'll sing on. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing and joyful be. For all eternity, I'll sing on, I'll sing on. Through all eternity, I'll sing on.
Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful, Sean. Well, we wish we were together in person, worshiping in the beautiful chapel in the Reserve, but we'll be there soon. Soon enough, we'll be together worshiping. But this is good to be able to still gather in our separate places and to stay safe in the meantime. So thank you for all the folks that have put this together and that have made this happen for this community. But I don't know about you, but I have noticed a trend in this quarantine, social distancing season on social media of people who are humble bragging on social media about these new skills and these new hobbies that they're taking on during quarantine. Anybody else notice this? Folks who are learning new languages, people who are taking up quilting, who are taking up gardening, who are learning how to play a new instrument, who are doing all these wonderful things, writing a novel during their quarantine time. I think I've learned two new things during quarantine. I have learned how to cut hair, which is really more out of necessity than anything else. We have a family of 6 at our home, and I've learned how long we can go without toilet paper. It turns out it's not very long. I don't recommend it. But these are the kinds of things we put ourselves in the position where we we sometimes are having to learn new things. The passage that we're looking at today is John chapter 9. And if you have a Bible, go ahead and grab it. Or I'm going to be reading out of the New Living Translation. So you can go ahead and open up the app on your phone, and you can go to the NLT, the New Living Translation, and we can read together. We're going to John chapter 9 today. And John chapter 9 is a passage that is about being willing to learn something new. Not so much about quilting or a new language or anything like that, but to be willing to learn something new about God. It's about having a teachable heart. And there's this real contrast that John is making in this passage in John 9 about those who are spiritually blind. And these are people who, they don't see God anywhere. Or if they see God anywhere, it's because they're only seeing him in the places where they expect to see him. They're not looking for him in any new places. And these spiritually blind people are contrasted with this one person who has spiritual sight. At least we find out at the end of the passage, he's the one with spiritual sight because he finds God everywhere. In fact, he finds God in the places where you would least expect to find God. So it's this idea of, and the difference between those who are spiritually blind and the people who have spiritual sight in this passage is really just one thing. It's a teachable heart. It's a teachable heart. So let's go to John chapter 9 and let's read it together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a section. It's a long passage, but I'm going to read a section and we'll stop and we'll talk about it for a few minutes. And then we'll go ahead and read some more and talk about it and we'll move on like that. John chapter 9, as Jesus was walking along, as he so often does, he saw, already we're introduced to that idea of sight. He saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? So already this idea of sight has shown up. Jesus sees this blind man. Of course, the blind man doesn't see Jesus, but Jesus sees him. And isn't that so often? There's like a theological reality there that God sees us in our blindness. God sees us in our darkness, and he kind of camps out there. And he's like, I'm just going to stay here until she wakes up. I'm going to stay here until she's able to see that I'm here waiting for her. And the disciples see something too. They see the blind man, but they don't see the blind man in the same way that Jesus does. They see a man who has sinned. They see a man who has sinned. They ask Jesus the question, who sinned? Him or his parents? They are a product of their culture. They have this kind of cultural lens that they see the world through. And so they just assume that this man must have, if someone is blind, it's because they sinned. They did something wrong. And if this guy was born blind, then either he sinned in utero or maybe his parents sinned. And that's why he's blind. They're a product of their culture. And we look at that and we say, oh my goodness, I can't believe anyone would ever think that, that blindness is a result of sin. And yet we're not too theologically far off sometimes from the disciples, are we? Because it's not uncommon for us, I have been guilty of it myself, to say things like, what did I do wrong to deserve this situation? What have I done to deserve this diagnosis? It's not fair that I'm the one who lost the job. It's not fair that I'm the one who's in this situation. Anyone besides me ever been there before? Well, so we keep reading in this passage here in John 9, and it says, Jesus answers the disciples' question. They say, is it because of his own sin or his parents' sins? And Jesus responds, starting in verse 3, it was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the task assigned us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. And then he spit on the ground, made mud with saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go, wash yourself in the pool of Siloam, and Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. So his neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, well, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said he was, others said no, it just looks like him, but the beggar kept saying, yes, I'm me, I'm the same one. They asked, who healed you? What happened? He told them, the man they called Jesus made mud, spread it over my eyes, and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. Where is he now? They asked. I don't know, he replied. I find it an interesting response here from his neighbors. It says these were his neighbors. These are people who had known him since he was born. These are people who he grew up with, maybe even. And their response to him having sight for the very first time, can you imagine your neighbor, your next door neighbor, your longtime friend, someone that you grew up with, comes to you and all of a sudden they can see. They've never had light enter their eyes before. What would your response be? I mean, I would think that probably you would be jumping for joy, right? You would be celebrating. You would be showing them around the neighborhood. Let's go on a walk. Let's go look at trees. This is the color green. This is the color blue. You'd be introducing him to all your friends. You would be so excited. You would want to celebrate what's going on. And yet here, their response is, it's apathetic. They're just like, is it him? Is it not him? I mean, they're slightly curious. They have a couple questions, but they are not filled with the kind of joy that you think they would have. They have this response. So here is God showing up in their community in a powerful way, and their response is apathy. Okay, let's keep reading. Then in verse 13 we pick up, then they took the man who had been born blind to the Pharisees. Because it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him, the Pharisees asked the man all about it. So he told them, he put the mud over my eyes, and when he washed it away, I could see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man Jesus is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath. Others said, but how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? So there was a deep division of opinion among them. Then the Pharisees questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? The man replied, I think he must be a prophet. So here are the Pharisees. We've looked at the response of his neighbors, but now we're looking at the response of the Pharisees. How do the Pharisees respond to this incredible instance of God showing up in their midst in a powerful way? Their response is one of fear. Really, it's fear and defensiveness is how it shows up. Jesus is always going to threaten our sense of power and control. When we want to be in control of our lives, we want to be the architect of our lives, we want to protect the little bit of power that we have, and Jesus is always going to push in on that. He's going to take the values and the beliefs and the goals that we're trying so hard to protect, and he is going to push on those in gentle ways. And if God pushes back on any of that, what do? We get defensive. And so how do they get defensive? This is so often the way that we get defensive too. All of a sudden they're kind of like picking at the technique of this. They can't deny the fact that Jesus did this, but then they're like, oh, he shouldn't have done it on the Sabbath. They're trying to find a loophole in the healing. Well, here's the technique. Here's why it went. And so suddenly everything that is done here, the incredible miracle that we've witnessed here, is a little suspect, because it didn't happen the way we think it should have happened. Anyone else been guilty of that? We turn to defensiveness instead of celebrating where God is showing up. God is continually showing up in unexpected places and through unexpected people in our lives, even during this quarantine season. He is. And I think so many times it's the most, just like in Scripture over and over again, it's the most upstanding citizens. It's the people who are the defenders of truth. These are the people who sometimes are the last people to get it. The last people to see the miracle in their midst. And I don't want to be on that end of the stick. I don't want to be the one who's the last person to catch on to what God is up to and what God is doing. God is showing up. And the Pharisees choose fear. What miracles are we missing out on because we want God to do it our way? We're like, this is how it's supposed to work, God. Okay, let's keep reading. Verse 18, because we have another response from another little party of people, a response to this miracle that's happening. In verse 18, the Jewish leaders still refused to believe that the man had been born blind and could now see, so they called his parents, the ultimate authority, right? They asked them, "Is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see?" His parents replied, "Well, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself." And just in case we think that these parents are, doing a good thing by trying to, encourage independence and autonomy on the part of their son, John includes this little disclaimer. He says in verse 22, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, "He's old enough. Ask him." Any nominations for Parents of the Year here? I mean, let me get this straight. Their son has been miraculously healed. I mean, they probably spent years praying for something just like this to happen in their son's life. All of a sudden, their son has a possibility of a future that doesn't involve begging by the side of the road, right? That they can actually make eye contact with their son and lock eyes with him for the first time in their life and share a glance. Like, how amazing would that be? Maybe they could even, go for a stroll along the Sea of Galilee and take in a sunset together. Like, you'd think their imaginations would be running wild with all the things that they could do with their son. And yet instead they throw their son under the bus so that they don't get thrown out of the synagogue. They care more about the country club of the synagogue and what people think and being included with the people and pleasing all the powers that be than they do about the miracle right in front of them. They're missing out on the miracle that they'd likely spent a lifetime praying for because they are afraid of rejection. God is showing up right in front of them, and they choose self-preservation. Okay, let's keep reading. So in verse 24, so for the second time, they called in the man who had been born blind and told him, "God should get the glory for this because we know this, but because God should not get the glory for this, because we know that this man Jesus is a sinner." "I don't know whether he is a sinner," the man replied, "but I know this. I was born blind and now I can see." By the way, like full stop for a second. If that is not a budding, blossoming profession of faith right there, I don't know what is. I mean, if we're paying attention in this passage, we're seeing this man who started out just minding his business by the side of the road and got healed, to someone who said, "Well, I think he might be a prophet," to eventually saying, "Well, I don't know who he is." And then finally, here he is saying, I don't know who he is, but I once was blind, but now I can see." Like, there is this profession of faith happening that's really beautiful. We're going to continue seeing that unfold as we keep reading. "But what did he do?" they asked. "How did he heal you?" "Look," the man explained. At this point, he's tired of telling the story. We might be tired of reading it by this point. He says, "I told you once, didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again?" And then there's a little bit of kind of cheeky sarcasm here. He says, "Do you want to become one of his disciples too?" And then they cursed him. And they said, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from." "Why, that's very strange," the man replied. "He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he is ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he wouldn't have done it." "You were born a total sinner," they answered. "Are you trying to teach us?" And they threw him out of the synagogue. The translation is, "We liked you better when you were blind." It's really what they're saying. These Pharisees, we come back around to them again, because they have tried everything to discredit this man, to disqualify the miracle that has happened in his life. And now everything this man is saying is making perfect sense. They can't find any more ways to poke holes in his story. And so they just finally turn on him and they totally dismiss him. They throw him out. Even though everyone has verified it. I mean, the man has said, "I'm the one." The neighbors are like, "Yeah, that's the one that we grew up with." Even his parents are like, "Yep, that's our son." But the Pharisees still refuse to believe because they have these hearts that are hard. I don't think we probably have hard hearts like the Pharisees, but I think it's worth stopping for a moment and gently considering, God, where are the places in my heart where there is a small callus starting to form? Where there's a small opposition to what you're doing around me that is starting to form. The Pharisees have these hearts, but what about us that are hard? It seems that no matter where God is and what he puts in front of us, that it should be a red flag to us maybe if our response is fear or apathy or defensiveness or self-preservation. So here are the Pharisees. They're disgusted, they're embarrassed by this guy, they're quite frankly probably convicted by this guy, and so they throw him out. It reminds me of what Paul says in Romans 1:18, where he says that the wrath of God is being revealed to those who suppress the truth. Who suppress the truth. I mean, I hear that word suppress, and I literally think of like a beach ball. You ever tried to hold a beach ball underwater? What does it keep doing? It just keeps like bobbing up to the top. It keeps bouncing up to the top over and over again. And I think that this is kind of like what God's truth is like. We can try our hardest to suppress it. We can try our hardest to push it down, but it will always keep showing up and bouncing up in our lives. We're tempted to suppress God's truth because his truth always exposes who we really are. And we have to admit, I'm just like this guy. I'm like this blind guy. I'm blind too. Okay, let's read this last section together. Starting in verse 30, it says, "When Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man." Hang on a second. This is probably one of my favorite moments in the passage. It says he found the man. Like, this guy had been thrown out of the synagogue, and Jesus goes after him. He hunts him down. He finds him. I love that. So he finds this guy, and he says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the man answered, "Well, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him." "You have seen him," Jesus said, "and he is speaking to you." "Yes, Lord, I believe," the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. It is fascinating to me that right here, in this passage, John doesn't bother recording this guy's response to having his physical sight restored. We don't know. We know he went to the pool of Siloam, that he came back and he was able to see. But John takes special note to include this man's response to his spiritual sight. That when the eyes of his heart are open, what does he do? He falls down on his face and he worships Jesus. So let's keep reading here. He says, "Yes, Lord, I believe," and he worshiped Jesus. Then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind." Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, "Are you saying we're blind? If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty," Jesus replied. "But you remain guilty because you claim you can see." There is this unexpected reversal that happens in this passage, isn't there? Because at the beginning of the passage, who is blind? Like, if I could reach the screen right now and I could hear you, you would be saying, well, the person at the beginning of the passage that's blind is the blind man, right? And who are the people who can see, who are enlightened at the beginning of the passage? Well, it's the religious leaders, right? It's the Pharisees. And that somehow, somewhere along the way in this passage, there is this role reversal. There is this cross that happens. And by the end of the passage, as Jesus reveals more and more of who he is and who we are, because that's what happens when he reveals who he is, we find out who we really are. By the end of the passage, who is it that is spiritually blind? Yeah, it's the Pharisees. And who is it that has spiritual sight? It's the blind man. And the only difference between the Pharisees and this man is this: a teachable heart. A heart that says, yeah, I have more to learn. I have more to learn. Scientists tell us that there is more physically, there's more to seeing than just like functioning eyes. These, our eyes are an organ, these organs that work properly. Thanks to modern science, a person can be born blind, just like the guy in this passage, and they can receive, if they're eligible, they can receive a cornea transplant. They can be given the gift of sight for the first time. And the thing that the medical community has learned is that it takes more than just a surgeon and a procedure to help someone see, because some of these folks will wake up from this surgery and they will still have no capacity to understand the light that's coming into their eyes, that there are no pathways yet set up in their brain to help them interpret what it is that's being seen. This is a powerful spiritual truth that I want you guys to just let it settle in here for a second. Some of these patients report still being fully blind, even though their eyes are working perfectly. And it tells us that it takes an ability to learn something new to be able to see. It takes a teachable heart. It takes this humility to be able to start all over again, to say that I have something new to learn. And this is, my friends, the good news of the gospel, isn't it? If we're willing to accept it, it is saying, guess what? Yeah, I'm blind. I was born blind. And yes, God can do new things. God can show up even in this season in a new way. He can show up in an unexpected way through unexpected people. And yes, I need more of God even now. I don't have it all figured out. I have new things to learn. In fact, maybe I have everything to learn. So I don't know what this season, I think, in the state of South Carolina, we're moving into phase 2 of COVID-19. And that means a lot of different things for a lot of people. For some of you, this season has been a season of, an unexpected vacation, maybe a little longer vacation than you really wanted. But it's been a chance for you to rest. For some of you, you have been working endlessly, just trying to keep up. And for some of you, this has been a real season of grief and loss and heartache, and maybe some of us even suffering is what this season has been. All I know is that God is showing up. And if we're willing to see it, if we're willing to learn something new and see these unexpected ways that God is showing up, that he can open up the eyes of our heart. I want to end with 2 questions for you, and then I just want to pray, okay? Where is your heart growing calluses? Where are those places where you see that fear or defensiveness or maybe even apathy showing up, even in small ways? And then secondly, where can I look for God's presence in this season? It might be in the middle of my suffering, but I promise you, God is there, waiting to work a miracle. Let me pray for you. Lord Jesus, we thank you for the way that you see us before we see you, and the way that you wait patiently for us. I don't know if spiritual sight in this season for us is going to be, an immediate thing. For some of us, maybe it is. And for some of us, maybe it's going to be a slow unveiling, a slow unfolding, like it was for this blind man over the course of the passage. But God, either way, I pray that you will give us hearts like this blind man. Hearts that are open, hearts that are willing to learn something new about you and about ourselves. Give us that kind of humility in your name. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us for Reserve Worship.